Good morning, and welcome to today's Mayoral Forum, the only Mayoral Forum, in fact, focused on the future of public housing. My name is David Jones, and I'm President and CEO of the Community Service Society. This is the second forum CSS has held where the candidates for mayor address the issues affecting low-income New Yorkers, working people. More than half the city's poor households are either public housing residents, hold NYCHA Section 8 vouchers, or is on one of NYCHA's waiting lists for public housing or vouchers. That's well over 500,000 New Yorkers united in their concern and anxiety about the future of affordable housing here in New York City. Over the past 2 decades, affordable housing for low-income families in the city has been drying up at an incredible rate. And now NYCHA and the current mayor want to transform this critical public housing resources by leasing NYCHA land to private developers to generate funds not forthcoming from any level of government. Today, the candidates will tell us where they stand on these issues, and they will do so before an audience and constituency of NYCHA residents, workers, their advocates, and concerned elected officials. We welcome them and look forward to hearing what they have to say on what is the most critical issue, I think, in the city of New York. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Greg Floyd of Teamsters Local 237.
I want to thank David Jones and the Community Service Society for partnering with Local 237 on this very important subject. I think most of us here would agree that public housing is in a crisis. It went from a well-respected, shining example of civic responsibility that received national acclaim to a mismanaged, in-debt housing authority nightmare for both residents and workers. As president of Local 237, our 9,000 NYCHA workers, a third of which live in public housing, are on the front line of defense. They have almost an impossible task of repairing and maintaining developments without having the resources or effective plan to get their jobs done without a 2-year delay. Plus, if NYCHA's new secretive proposal to lease property to private developers comes to pass, there will be less NYCHA property to repair and maintain and no union jobs guaranteed by the developers. I was asked the other day, why do we need a mayoral forum on public housing? To me, it's a no-brainer. The plan for public housing by the next mayor will help shape the direction of public housing for generations to come. We want to make sure that the candidates know the problems. We want to find out what their thinking is. We want to make sure they're committed to public housing. We want to know how they plan to restore NYCHA. How will they help make NYCHA a resource of pride for residents and workers once again? One of these candidates will become the next mayor of our city. We need to know the answers to the questions. I now want to introduce to you a popular radio personality, WWRL's Mark Rowley, whose morning show airs 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Monday to Friday. Mark is taping this forum, which will be aired today at 3 p.m. and on Monday, when we will be once again discussing public housing with listeners starting at 6 a.m. Tune in to 1600 a.m. Mark?
Thank you so much, Greg, and good morning to everyone who has come together here. Before I go into my prepared remarks, Greg just said something that just really struck me. Somebody asked him why the need for a mayoral forum on public housing. Now, see, Greg is a nice guy, all right? I try to be a nice guy if I'm on the radio. But if somebody asked me that face to face, I would look at them and say, what are you, drunk? What do you mean, why? Ladies and gentlemen, the people that live in public housing in this city deserve a mayoral forum. You've earned this. Nobody's doing this, because you haven't earned it. You've earned the right to hear what people have to say about your future. I've said this a few times before, and I'm going to say it again today. In 1950, in this city, 2.692 million people voted for mayor. That is the highest number in the history of this city. 4 years ago, in 2009, 1.155 million people voted. With a population that's at least 750,000 people more than there were in 1950. Ladies and gentlemen, if you turn out to vote, you will influence the future of the places where you live. That said, it is my distinct honor to introduce today's moderator. Having been around for a minute, I have had the pleasure of talking to and reading some of the great columnists in the history of this city. I'm talking about the Breslins, the Hamels, Murray Kempton, who once was in my studio. I thought I had gone to heaven. I put our moderator today in that same category. He was a tenant organizer in Brooklyn, which means he was a hard-working New Yorker, still is, but a hard-working New Yorker just like you. He embarked on a career in journalism. It spanned 30 years. He's a former City Hall bureau chief for Newsday, former New York City bureau chief for the Washington Post, currently a columnist for the New York Times, where he writes about city government. The best tribute anyone can offer about our moderator, Michael Powell, is this. Rudy Giuliani hated his guts. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Michael Powell.
Hello. If our candidates could come out now. I very much appreciate all of your coming here today, and as all the speakers have spoken about, public housing is part of the absolute fabric, the essential fabric of the city. You have virtually the population of Boston or Washington, D.C. in our public houses. There are 179,000 apartments, and they are islands of affordability in a city that is obviously becoming more and more expensive, virtually by the day. With that preamble, I'm interested, and I guess we'll just start. We'll do this in the simplest possible way. We'll start here and we'll work down. And I'll give, say, 3 minutes. I would be interested in knowing what your vision is for the future of public housing. What, if anything, we can do to sustain the public housing communities, and how, assuming that we all sort of agree, and I take that as a sort of a given, that plays a vital role, how do you do it? How do you secure the operating capital money, and how do you essentially restore it to its one-time and long-time reputation as public housing that works? And first, former City Comptroller Bill Thompson.
Thank you, Michael. Let me thank David Jones from CSS, Greg Floyd, the president of Teamsters, all of the sponsors of this morning's forum, and for all of you coming out this morning, good morning, everybody. It is great to be here to have this discussion about the future of New York City, and NYCHA is part of the future of New York City. It is clear that the 600,000 residents of New York City Housing Authority have been treated as second-class citizens. They've been ignored. They've been pushed on the side. They've been made to believe as if they're invisible. I know that you are not. Future of New York City Housing Authority should be very different. We look at a system right now where the mayor and the housing authority have warehoused thousands of units all across the city of New York in the middle of the worst housing crisis that we've had. We need to be able to bring those units back online, take the $1 billion, $1 billion that is sat on the side, use it to repair those apartments and make other major repairs in the housing authority, bring those units back online and put those who need that housing desperately in them. We need to get rid of the current board structure. We need to get rid of it today. I believe it's important. Let's put a board in place, an 11-member board. You know something? 5 of those members should be housing authority residents from around the borough. Give the members of the housing authority a voice. Let's stop paying on the salaries to the board members. Let's have those other members. Yes, a chair who's the operational person that the mayor appoints. The other 5 members, let them have expertise in housing and management. Let them bring something to the table rather than just sit there and collect the salaries. We need to work a system out that does the repairs a lot faster, does them in local areas, making sure those repairs are done. They don't languish for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. They get done right away so the residents don't have to put up with holes in the walls, leaks, things that don't work, broken appliances. We need to make sure we move those quickly. We don't need to sell our land for luxury housing. I was at Douglas Houses, and the people there are scared to death. If we're going to do anything with the land, at any of our housing authority developments, let us use it for affordable housing, for middle, moderate income housing, workforce housing. Let's make sure we do that. Let's also, and I can see I'm running out of time, the housing authority, the people who live in the housing authority pay taxes too. Why we are charging them for police protection, why we are charging them for sanitation, I don't understand. What we need is a mayor who's going to stand up and fight for the people in the housing authority, who's going to work with mayors across the country to get additional money from the federal government. We need a mayor who's going to stand up and fight and make sure that the people of the housing authority are part of the future of New York City.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you. Former Councilman Sal Albanese.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Let me start by congratulating David Jones of the Community Service Society and Local 237 and Greg Floyd for holding a forum on public housing, one of the most important services that the city offers and should sustain. I'm not accepting money from developers or lobbyists, by the way, which is unfortunate. Unfortunately, housing residents don't have lobbyists, and as a result, they're being neglected and ignored by state, city, and of course the federal level, which is an outrage. I want to follow some of the suggestions that have been made, follow up by saying that I think that we need to stop warehousing apartments. There are thousands of them. We need to put them back on the market and also clear up the backlog of repairs. It's outrageous that you have leaky roofs and doors that don't work, elevators that get stuck. There's benign neglect going on. There's no doubt about it, and that's very dangerous. And as I travel around the city and I speak to public housing tenants, they're very suspicious about what is the future of NYCHA. What is the city planning on doing with this benign neglect? In order to rebuild the trust, and I plan on doing that when I'm mayor, so we have to clear up those backlogs of repairs, stop warehousing those apartments, and provide the necessary services that people need. Hardworking people live in those complexes. They need services. For example, I opposed, when I was on the city council, the merger, the housing, transit, and police, because I said that it would lead to public housing residents being shortchanged in terms of police services. Sure enough, when I went to the Frederick Douglass houses the other night, what was the first thing that they said to me? They said, Mr. Albanese, we need vertical patrols. We need to be able to sleep at night. We need police officers that we know in our buildings. You know, $80 million is taken out of the NYCHA budget and distributed to other agencies in the city, and no services are being provided. So we need to do that as well. I've proposed hiring 300 more officers and assigning them to the Housing Bureau and establishing rapport between the housing tenants and the police, which is essential. That trust is essential. So, and I also agree with Bill's suggestion that the NYCHA board has to have representatives of the tenants on that board. And let's stop paying $190,000 a year to people who are basically political patronage hires. So, as mayor, I'm committed to making sure that we restore NYCHA to its former glory.
Thank you very much. Public Advocate Bill de Blasio.
Thank you. Let me thank Local 237 and CSS and all the sponsors, David Jones, Greg Floyd, for your tremendous leadership. I have to also say you've chosen with Michael Powell and Mark Riley, two of the real consciences we have in journalism in this city, so thank you for that. Why don't we start by talking about our current mayor for a moment. Let's talk about Michael Bloomberg. Now, Michael Bloomberg suddenly got interested in NYCHA recently because he realized when people look at his legacy, it will be clear he did nothing for NYCHA. It'll be clear he left NYCHA behind. Now, I've spent plenty of time fighting Michael Bloomberg. In fact, I led the opposition in the city council trying to stop him from changing the term limits law and getting that third term. And Tish James, thank you. Rosie Mendez, thank you for your leadership. So the mayor ignored 500,000 people for 12 years. And look, I spent a lot of time in NYCHA buildings. I talked to a lot of residents. I talked to a lot of resident leaders. NYCHA residents have been put through hell. It is not acceptable the city of New York has consistently turned its back on 500,000 of our fellow residents. The federal government's worse. Let me be fair. The federal government started turning its back 30 years ago on public housing residents. But it is the job of the mayor not to accept that status quo. In this case, though, I have to indict the current administration further. You know, right now in New York City, I often say we're living a tale of two cities. Literally, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer before our eyes. And it's not acceptable. It's not sustainable. It will tear this city apart if it's not addressed. That's why forums like this are so important. This is what we have to be talking about in this city. What do? I agree part of it is the next mayor has to be even more passionate about bringing resources to public housing and other affordable housing efforts and mass transit. I appreciate what the mayor did on gun control, immigration, climate change nationally. I wouldn't for a moment say those weren't good things. But the mayor's first responsibility, it's about economics. It's about bringing resources to our people. And he didn't challenge that status quo in Washington. The next mayor not only has to challenge it, has to lead the charge nationally and bring together mayors from all over the country to focus on that, our fair share from Washington. Now, right here in the city, let's be clear. We can talk about the horrible neglect. We can talk about the repairs that weren't made. My office at Public Advocate, the number one complaint we get is repairs not made at NYCHA. We have been fighting now for years, case by case, development by development, to get those repairs made. But let's be clear. We're talking about developments in so many cases over 40 years old, over 50 years old, over 60 years old. For those that were in the areas hit by Sandy, they've been set back even more. So if we're going to address this, right, it's going to be changing the rules in Washington. Not just a little, changing the rules. Mayoral leadership that changes rules, in Albany as well. It's going to take not Bloomberg's version of development, because that's privatization. We won't do that. We will never accept anything that will undermine the current developments, that will undermine the right of tenants to be there. We're never going to accept anything that's a slippery slope to tearing down buildings, as Michael mentioned, happen elsewhere. What we can do is acknowledge that NYCHA doesn't just need $1 billion. NYCHA needs tens of billions of dollars to bring these buildings up to the quality levels people deserve. And anything, just finishing, anything we do to achieve that has to be with tenants and has to guarantee there will be hiring of tenants for any development that is done.
Okay. Thank you. Comptroller John Liu.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for moderating. I also have to point out to my friend Mark Riley, I don't think Rudy Giuliani was that fond of you either, Mark. So I think we're all in good company here. A few weeks ago, I was talking with Greg Floyd, the head of our Teamsters 237, and we were talking about a lot of these issues that we're talking about publicly today. And he mentioned that there was this forum that was going to happen. So I do want to thank all of you for coming out on a Saturday morning. I mean, this is Saturday morning here, and we have hundreds of people. It shows how dedicated and commitment we all are to making sure that our NYCHA communities are successful and are given the resources and attention that they need to be successful. Thank you very much, David Jones, as well, for co-sponsoring and all the organizations that are a part of this. We are at a crisis level when it comes to public housing in New York City. 600,000 fellow New Yorkers who have been ignored by this administration for 12 years. 600,000 people, children, families, seniors, working men and women. And the NYCHA communities are in so many ways the bedrock communities of neighborhoods all across the city of New York. And yet, we always hear that, we don't have resources for this or that. Well, if we don't have resources, how can it be then, if NYCHA doesn't have resources, how can it be that NYCHA has to pay $200 million a year for city police and sanitation services that nobody else has to pay in the city of New York? If you live in a NYCHA building, you have to pay your share for police and sanitation services. Meanwhile, somebody could be living in a luxury high-rise across the street from you, and they don't have to pay any more. We all pay taxes, and yet the people across the street don't have to pay any more. That doesn't make sense. If NYCHA doesn't have any money, why were they, last year, it was a big scandal, they were sitting on $42 million of funding that council member, our chairperson, Rosie Mendez, and many other members of the city council allocated for security cameras, and they did nothing with. And when my office took a closer look at it, we found that it wasn't just $42 million. Unfortunately, that was just the tip of the iceberg. They were sitting on $1 billion, that billion with a B, $1 billion of capital funding that should have, could have, and long time ago should have improved, fixed the elevators, the door locks, improved the lighting in the windows, fixed the boilers, so that NYCHA residents' quality of life could have been improved that much further. And yet now, they want to sell, as Bill Thompson said, they want to sell property on NYCHA to build luxury housing, the so-called infill, when they claim that they, are you sure that's 3 minutes? She's got to stop. I'll be very brief, okay? The infill idea is, once again, an idea of this Bloomberg administration to sell off public property that belongs to the people of this city, not developers, not high-rise, the people of this city. And once we sell that asset, we'll never be able to get it back. This is a bad idea.
Okay,
Let's make sure NYCHA uses the resources that they have, not squander it, and make sure that we're not building additional high-rise and luxury development on the backs of working men and women in this city.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome Speaker Christine Quinn. And what we've talked about is, we started off talking about the sort of dire state of public housing in the city. The fact that it, houses population of Washington, D.C., essentially, and yet, has been cut for years on the federal, at the state, and the city level. What I'd like to do, if I could, is sort of combine for you, weave two questions together into one. One is, what is your vision? I mean, given that these very pressing financial problems exist for public housing within a context of a broader fiscal problems for the city as a whole. And then the question that came up here is, specifically, this was the second round we're on now, is the question of, that public housing pays $70 million a year for policing, it pays for sanitation, for water, a number of things that others don't. And interested, so if you wouldn't mind, try to get the two of those kind of woven together, and I'll give you 3 minutes.
Thank you. And first I want to apologize for being late and thank Greg Floyd and David Jones and everyone at CSS and 237 for understanding that months ago I had made a commitment to participate in an event, an anti-bullying event with high schools across the city. So thank you for allowing me to come to this event late, since I had made that prior commitment and didn't want to back out on it. You know, there is no question that NYCHA, on some level, has financial challenges, and everyone does right now. The thing we don't know is exactly what is the full extent or not of the Housing Authority's financial situation, because there are numerous examples of them being allocated money. In one case, $84 million in capital money from the City Council to put in cameras that they haven't used. There's other studies that show even much larger significant amounts of money on the table that NYCHA hasn't used. We need to get NYCHA to be managing its money better, spending the money it has, but there really is no reason why NYCHA tenants are the only New Yorkers who are paying the city for services that every other New Yorker gets because they are taxpayers. It's unfair for NYCHA residents' rents to have to go to the City of New York in this payment for services. There are no other tenants or New Yorkers who have to do that, so we have to put a stop to those payments so those funds can stay in the Housing Authority to help the Housing Authority have the funds it needs. But it's not just going to be about funding with the Housing Authority. We have to make significant overhauls in the management structure to make sure that funds are being spent efficiently, transparently, and we're not doing things like having a $5 million system to manage $5 million worth of supplies, for example.
I want to thank the candidates, of course, for coming here and for giving us their time. And thank all of you.
NYCHA is New York City's largest tenant landlord. 650,000 people live in NYCHA, more than most major cities in the United States. It's important that these residents do not go ignored into the future. NYCHA can and will elect the next mayor. So it's very important to understand the power of NYCHA and the power of the vote and what has been done over the last 30 years. NYCHA has been ignored, and it's time the tenants woke up and understood the power of their voice. Local 237 has 1/3 of its membership living in public housing and also working in public housing. It's important that we stand up for our members, and NYCHA is a vital part of our operation.